Hello and welcome back to the second portion of Chapter 2. We are going to talk about the endocrine system, which is a separate set of chemicals in the body that is not electrochemical, that is not action potential related, and yet we will see that there is a controlling of this system also by the brain. Then we will get into the brain itself and talk about the old brain versus the new brain and look at the parts of the brain and what they do as far as structure and function, and the lobes of the brain and what they're responsible for with their individual parts. So, without further ado, the endocrine system is a different set of chemicals, which we call hormones, which do not go from cell to cell, but instead are actually a set of glands that secrete these chemicals or hormones into the bloodstream. One of the things you may have already noticed, if you know, is that the sympathetic nervous system that we talked about in the last lecture is one of the things that it does when it's ramping us up for fight or flight is that it sends out adrenaline, which goes sends a signal to the adrenal glands. Well, the adrenal glands and adrenaline is part of this hormone system, which we call the endocrine system. So hormones don't travel from cell to cell. They don't have to swim across a synapse. What they do is they get released into the bloodstream, and wherever the blood carries it, the hormones go with it. So hormones travel through the body and affect all other tissues, including the brain. So that adrenaline that was released into the body for fight or flight, at least a signal of it goes into the brain. The brain is not just fluid. Endocrine system. So one of them, which is like the main assistant or the vice president, is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is, by the way, pituitary is Latin for P-shaped. So the pituitary gland is the master gland that basically sends the signal to the hormones to release. The other glands also get their message from the pituitary glands. So this includes the adrenal glands, which send out, again, adrenaline. So if we were to go back to that example of the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system, pituitary gland is telling the adrenal glands during this time, hey, we need to ramp up our production of adrenaline. And so adrenaline is released. The body gets more of that adrenaline, energy, muscle control, and then when it's done, the pituitary has to tell the adrenal glands to shut it off, or at least, stop production. The pituitary, as I said, is the second in charge, the administrative assistant or vice president. And the one that is in charge of the endocrine system is called the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is one of those rare structures that doesn't look like anything special. So when it was named for where it's located. Hypo means below, and there's another structure called the thalamus, which is pretty much right above it. So hypothalamus actually means below the thalamus. That structure of cells below the thalamus. The hypothalamus is the one in charge. It's in charge of our emotional systems. It's in charge of our sleep-wake cycle. It's in charge of releasing of the hormones. So in this intricate feedback system, putting the big picture together, the hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland, hey, we need adrenaline. The pituitary gland then sends that signal to the adrenal glands to produce adrenaline, and boom, we can activate fight or flight. Other hormones can be released that influence the brain, calcium, sex hormones, right? A bunch of other things. And when it's time to shut them down and start the parasympathetic nervous system, then the hypothalamus tells the pituitary, and the pituitary tells the adrenal glands, all right, that's enough adrenaline, we good. So here is the feedback system. Brain, meaning the hypothalamus, tells the pituitary gland. The pituitary tells the other glands. That could be the thyroid gland to help with metabolism. It could be the adrenal glands, again, for adrenaline. The pancreas to regulate blood sugar. The ovaries and testes for sex hormones. The parathyroids for calcium levels in the blood. And it's, again, the hypothalamus and pituitary that are in charge. So in this feedback system, hypothalamus to pituitary to the other glands, do your things, release your hormones. That goes up through the bloodstream, through the body, back up to the brain. And the hypothalamus says, okay, we're out of danger, let's shut it down. And in that rest and digest system, we are turning off the sex hormones or the adrenal glands, and we are telling the pancreas to lower the blood sugar rate. So even though the hormone system is a complete other system with a different set of chemicals that goes through the entire body, it still shows the interplay between the nervous system and the endocrine systems, and it still shows that the brain, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, are in charge of the endocrine system. So again, even though it's a completely different system, the brain is still in charge of everything we do, including hormone production and hormone control. So the next thing that we are talking about is the different ways that neuroscience and biological psychology has allowed us to be able to look at the function and structure of our brain. It used to be back in the day, of course, not too long ago, that the only way you could actually look inside the brain body was dead, and they were able to go in through autopsy and look at the brain. Don't worry, I'm not going to show you graphic images. But nowadays, starting since the 1950s, scientists have developed technology and been able to look at the brain using different pieces of technology. And the science can actually selectively destroy if we need to see the function of the brain, or electrically, chemically, or magnetically stimulate the brain in order for us to see if there is damage to the structure of the brain, if there is problems with blood flow in the brain. By the way, the blood clot in the brain is what we know of as a stroke. In the 50s, the first way to look at brain activity without actually going into the brain was called an EEG, or an electroencephalogram. And what that is we'll talk about this a little more during the sleep chapter in chapter 3. But the EEG is a machine. Well, it's basically these electrodes that you stick over on top of your skull. So there's no wires or anything like that. You put the little electrodes on your skull, pretty comfortable. And what it does is it reads your brain wave activity. So it reads the activity of your brain, how it's firing, how the neurons are firing, the pattern. And it allows us to see things like if there's an irregular pattern. It kind of looks like a seismograph that measures earthquake activity. So you can see the little things running, and it makes like wave patterns. This is very useful for sleep studies because we can tell what level or stage of sleep you're in. And again, you don't need to know what that means until chapter 3 in a couple chapters. And that you can be able to see if there is a sharp amount of activity or less activity in the brain. It doesn't show the structure, but it does show brainwave activity. The PET scan, which is very similar to the CAT scan or CT, was developed a few years later. And basically what that does is you can take these radioactive dyes that are not going to hurt you, and basically it shows where the energy and the chemical flow is in your brain. So if there is a part of the brain that is not flowing correctly, or if there is some damage, you can see it. It'll kind of light up like a Christmas tree in this PET scan. The CAT scan is almost the same thing, which looks at blood flow for people that are at risk for strokes, and that one is a black and white version of this. The PET scan lights up in really cool colors. So just in case you ever wanted to know that. About 30 or 40 years ago, they were able to use magnets to be able to take an image of the brain to look for any structural damage. And some of you guys may have had an MRI in your life, on your shoulder, your knee, maybe even your brain. I got into a car accident about 14 years ago, and I had to have an MRI of my neck and my spine, which was oh so much fun. So the really cool thing about that is that if there is any structural damage to the brain, we can use the MRI to take pictures at different levels of the brain, and it can show if there's any structural damage. But you have to hold really still, and all it does is take still photographs. The coolest invention, I'd probably say, that has to do with neuroscience in the last 25 years or so is what's been called the fMRI, which stands for functional MRI. The cool thing about the functional MRI is that you can do a task, and while you're doing the task, it will measure and show the activity in your brain. So it can show blood flow, and it can show neurotransmitter activity, and you can see the brain light up. The more energy being used, the more it's a red or yellow color. The less energy that's being used, it's more of a blue or purple color. So you can actually see where the information is going, where blood is flowing, neurotransmitters are going in the brain while you're doing a task. We can actually use an fMRI to quote unquote read your brain. I wouldn't say read your mind, because that's a little bit different, but you'll see what I mean when we get to the consciousness chapter of chapter 3. For instance, since I'm going to talk about this at the end of this chapter, the occipital lobe in the very back of the brain is for visual processing. So if somebody is hooked up to an fMRI and I ask them to look at a picture, the person that is looking at the fMRI come up on a computer screen may see the back of the brain light up. And if they do that, then they can say, oh, this person is looking at something. Will they know you're looking at a picture, or whether it's a book, or whether it's some, painting or something like that? No, but we know where the information is being processed and which part of the brain is specifically activated. So we know basically what you're doing. If you're hearing something, it'll light up in the brain above the ear, et cetera, et cetera. So the fMRI is probably the most advanced way to look at the brain and to see, is activity higher or lower in certain parts, which parts are being activated while you're doing something like a memory task or looking at a picture, right? Things like that. So these are the way that we can look in the brain, look for structure damage, look for other types of activity without having to actually go in and cut open the skull. So pretty cool. I can't get much farther without talking about the idea of evolution. And one of the things that people may have had some reservations about was when I sort of glossed over in chapter 1 the idea of using animal models to be able to compare and use for human studies. We can't use humans. We tend to use animals. Again, we go for some of the ones that are closest to the human brain, like primates, like chimpanzees, because they are 98.5% similar in genetics and brain structure. But we also use lower animals like mice and rats a lot of times, right? You hear about rats in a maze or mice in a maze or things like that. And the reason for that is because with evolution, the thing that separates us from the animals is the fact that we can think, reason, problem solve, plan our days in advance. So that's part of that new structure of the brain, which is that big, beautiful cortex. But underneath the cortex, which is the more evolved, newer part of the brain, we have the older parts of the brain. Some of the things I mentioned, like the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the brainstem that connects the spinal cord to the cortex, and other structures below this cerebral cortex that all vertebrate animals have, which means mice, rats, monkeys, dogs, cats, right? Whatever we've used in research, it's because they have a similar brain structure, which also comes with a lot of genetics that are common with humans. So no, we can't ask animals how they're feeling or what they think about things, but we can observe their behavior. Think about behaviorism, right? Watson and Skinner. And that some of the most primitive survival functions and behavior in life we can compare to animals and see if they are acting the same way we would. So in this case, if you as a human are scared of something, you tend to stay away from it. Maybe you tend to shake. Sometimes you freeze like a deer in headlights, right? That's what we see in mice and rats. If you like something, you go towards it and you try to get it. Well, when there's food available, that's exactly what we see in these lower animals. If they are angry or aggressive, they will attack other mice or rats or animals. This is what we see humans do all the time. So even though the older brain is, right, less complex, it handles the major behavioral functions, especially when it comes to survival. And again, if you consult with Charles Darwin, I mean, not now, he's dead, but that it's all about surviving and advancing your genetics, right? That's sort of the point of life. And so by staying out of danger and by being able to navigate life survival functions, that's exactly what you're doing. So the less complex brain in primitive vertebrates handles the survival functions. The lower you go down into the brain towards the spinal cord, the more primitive the function is. And we'll talk about this. The more complex brain in advanced mammals, including humans and higher order primates like chimpanzees, contain the new brain systems that are built on top of the old. So we still have all the stuff underneath in the old brain that all the animals have, all the vertebrate animals that have a spine. But the cortex on top is what separates us from these lower animals. So let's take a look at some of these older brain structures, starting from the bottom of the brain and working our way up to the new big, beautiful cortex. And we can see how animals might be able to be used in experiments where we are looking at their behavior in similar situations. Now, again, you may then argue that we only can look at sort of really fundamental survival functions or emotions or things like that. And I may argue that we can look at more complex issues, and I'll give you a demonstration as we go forward. So here is the brainstem and the thalamus, starting from the very bottom. And this is where you can start to review for your worksheet that I have provided as the second assignment. Your worksheet has numbers 1 through 9 on it. And as I told you guys in the prompt for that one, number 4 on your sheet is going to be the brainstem, which is actually below the medulla over here. And that connects, right, the other part. It's the other part of the central nervous system. The spinal cord is a root of that makes it possible for motor information from the brain to go down to the muscles, and for information about our 5 senses, and especially from our body to be processed up in the brain. So that is not pictured in this lecture, but that would be number 4 on your sheet. Here at the very bottom of the brainstem, there are 2 structures really that make the brainstem, called the medulla and the pons. And the medulla is responsible for the most primitive life survival or life sustaining functions, right, in order to be able to survive. So the medulla has two main functions. Normally, this is the point in class where I would say, when you're first born as a baby and you first come down the slide and out into the real world, and you are no longer in the womb, what are the two things that you need to be able to do in order to live? This is before you latch on to mama, before you get any milk or food, right? You need to be able to do two things. So I'm not going to ruin the suspense here. I am going to just tell you the two things that you need to do in order to survive once you come out into the real world is you need to have a heartbeat and you need to be able to breathe. Before you look around, before your vision gets clear, before you find mama, before you latch on and get some food, you need to be able to breathe and your heart needs to beat. So the medulla, as the very bottom part of the brain that makes up the bottom of the brainstem, is responsible for those two specific functions: heartbeat and respiration or breathing. On top of that, jutting out a little bit three-dimensionally, a little fatter, like a jug, is the pons. And the pons is actually made up of white matter. Remember that white matter is myelinated axons. Maybe I didn't actually say this. In the brain, we see gray matter and we see white matter. Gray matter is all the cell bodies and dendrites. The white matter is actually the myelinated axons that are taking information from neurons to other neurons and to other structures and to muscles. So the pons is actually made of a bunch of white myelinated axons that are going down from the brain to the muscles, right, via the spinal cord, to give information about movement. So the pons is involved in coordinating our muscles and movement. That, for all intents and purposes, is the brainstem. On top of the brainstem, you see a structure called the thalamus. And the thalamus actually has, which I believe is number 3 on your sheet. The thalamus has two main jobs. The thalamus is a relay station for 4 of the 5 senses. The only sense that does not go through the thalamus to its final destination is actually the sense of smell. And it's believed to be that taste and smell are kind of underneath the frontal lobe, so kind of right under here. So the idea is that with smell, you're just kind of going straight up here, and so you don't need to go all the way around. Here's the thalamus back here. From the nose, you're going straight here. So maybe there's just no reason to go all the way around. For taste, it's got to go up and around. Obviously hearing, vision, and things like that. So 4 of the 5 senses go through the thalamus, and the one that does not is the sense of smell. Looking at this chart, or looking at this artist rendering, what the artist did here was to expose the middle of the brainstem and thalamus and show you that there is a network of neurons that runs from the spinal cord up through the medulla and kind of settles and ends in the thalamus. And what this network of nerves is, it wouldn't be pictured if you didn't see it transparently, is called the reticular formation. Now, this is not going to be on your worksheet because, again, it wouldn't be visible on that sheet of paper or on that file. So what this is a network of nerves that runs through the brainstem from the spinal cord up to the thalamus, and this controls your levels of arousal. And if you remember, arousal levels in the brain, the chemical is norepinephrine. So this is a network of neurons, that is fanning out in the thalamus that is providing norepinephrine to the brain and gives it levels of energy and arousal. So again, looking that the brainstem at the bottom is the oldest and innermost brain region. The medulla, located down here at the base of the brain, controls that I also have to mention is And I'm not sure if this is a function to help with any brain damage or if it's left over from when humans were on 4 feet, 4 legs instead of 2, but the body is cross-wired. It's not 100% cross-wired. About 85 to 90% of the information crosses over. So any information, as you can see here, from the left side of the body is actually going to be processed in the right side of the brain, and vice versa. The right side of the body is going to be processed in the left brain. So I am left-handed. That's another interesting fact about me, which means that's right, I'm in my right mind. Okay, enough with the bad jokes. I don't apologize for bad jokes. But about 85 to 90% of the neurons cross over. So 85 to 90% from your left ear is going to be processed in the right brain. From the left eye is going to be processed in the right brain. From the right side of the body in the left brain, right? Majority of information crosses over at some point. There may be an evolutionary purpose for this or a protective purpose. We're not necessarily sure exactly what it was, but maybe it's to prevent against danger. If you suffer, as we'll talk about in this chapter, if you suffer brain damage earlier on, chances are the brain can repair itself to a degree, and sometimes the opposite hemisphere has to take over some of the work. So maybe this is a way to coordinate it before anything happens, sort of as a safety precaution. So again, the reticular formation is the network of nerves that runs through the brainstem and the thalamus, and it plays an important role in controlling arousal because, again, it is using the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. The higher amount of norepinephrine, the more activity and arousal level the brain has. The less norepinephrine, the more tired you are and less aroused. And the thalamus, again, sitting on top, is the area at the top of the brainstem. So it serves, I told you one purpose it served, that it directs sensory messages to the cortex, also transmits replies down to the muscles and to the lower part of the brain, like the medulla and the cerebellum, which we'll talk about soon. But so it's not only the relay station for 4 of the 5 senses, but just like we have myelin on the axons to make sure that this signal is nice and strong, the thalamus also serves as an amplifier. So not only does it send information to the right part of the brain about vision or hearing or touch or taste, but it also amplifies the signal to make sure the brain can actually interpret it, understand it, and get the message. Same thing when it sends the message down to the muscles, right? So the thalamus is both the relay station for 4 of the 5 senses, and it serves as an amplifier. The cerebellum does many things. The cerebellum means little cerebrum, and the cerebrum, like the cerebral cortex, because the cerebellum is located on the very back of the brainstem, right behind the pons and medulla, and it looks like a little version of the cerebral cortex, right? So cerebellum means little cerebrum or little cortex, and it is located just below the cortex and just behind the medulla and pons, behind the brainstem. Some people consider it part of the brainstem. So you can see that the cerebellum aids in things like the judgment of time, sound, and texture discrimination. So we can tell the difference between different sounds, different textures that we feel. It's also involved in emotional control. It does help process and store information outside of awareness. So when we get into that chapter on classical conditioning, which I told you was an unconscious thing for the brain, the cerebellum helps to process that information. But for this chapter, for your worksheet, for the exam that's coming up, the main function for this chapter that you need to know is that the cerebellum is coordinating voluntary movement and life-sustaining functions. So it helps the medulla to control breathing and heartbeat, and it helps the pons to control very specific movements. If you are learning to walk on a balance beam and keep your balance, it's a very specific movement. That is where the cerebellum comes in. If you're trying to hit a baseball at 80 to 90 miles an hour, like in the big leagues, although sometimes it goes up to 100 miles an hour. If you're coordinating a very specific dance move, my wife likes watching that dance show on Fox or whatever station it's on, ABC, I don't know, with J-Lo. And so I think about that, right? That it's the cerebellum that's coordinating these very specific movements and life-sustaining functions. So that's the main takeaway for the cerebellum. Now, what's not pictured in your on the slides and what's not pictured in the textbook so much, but we do talk about it a little bit, is this, there are actually more like 7 or 8 structures in the brain, but again, this is Psych 1. So this first structure, this first introductory lesson, we're going to talk about 3 main parts of the brain that are underneath the cortex that are involved in emotion and emotional control. So the brain's emotional center is called the limbic system. This neural system sits between the older parts of the brain and the hemisphere, so it's right underneath. In fact, 2 of these structures are kind of inside where what we would call the temporal lobe, which is one of the lobes of the brain. We'll talk about that. And these 3 centers include the hippocampus, which is actually, it sounds like there's a hippopotamus on your campus, but it's actually the Latin word for seahorse, because the first person who noticed it and discovered it in the brain said, that looks like a seahorse. So they called it the hippocampus. The hippocampus is involved in memory. It's also our internal GPS system. So when we're navigating our environment, there's a lot of times that people only don't need GPS because they know where they're going. Or if you've ever gone somewhere once and you know how to get there, then you have a really good, what we call spatial navigation in the hippocampus. The amygdala is the fear and rage center of the brain. So if you get scared or angry or a combination of those, that's the amygdala that's going off. And amygdala is Latin for almond. The amygdala is connected to and located near the hippocampus, and it is shaped like an almond. Again, it's not pictured on your worksheet. And finally, we have heard about the hypothalamus, which is again named for where it is, which is right below the thalamus, which is number 9 on your worksheet. And that one is responsible for your hormone systems and something I like to call the 5 F's, but I'll get to that when we get to that slide. So the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the limbic system, all linked to emotions. It controls the emotions. It's involved in memory as well, and your basic drives, specifically the hypothalamus. We'll talk about that with the 5 F's. So looking at the amygdala itself, the amygdala is actually 3 lima bean size clusters, but again, I'm not going to dispute the book. The book talks about 2 clusters. What do I know? I was just in a PhD program. Ha ha ha. Okay. So, so 2 or 3 structures, neural clusters, and we call them nuclei. A nucleus is a tight cluster of multiple cell bodies that makes up these structures. So it's linked to emotions, and the hypothalamus is located just above that. So the hypothalamus, again, is number 9 on your sheet, and it's the neural structure that is named for where it is, which is right below the thalamus. It is our motivational system because it is in charge of our drives. So if you hungry or full, thirsty or full, right? Or things like that. It also is in charge of temperature regulation. So when we get too hot, we start sweating. When we get too cold, maybe we shiver. That is also the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is responsible for what I call the 5 Fs. So feeding and drinking, right? Feeding, fight or flight, whether you stay in fight or run away, right? The hypothalamus is in charge of that system. Um, Fahrenheit, which is your temperature system, because in the US we use Fahrenheit, right? So we have Fahrenheit, fight, flight, we have feeding and drinking, and the last F, it's also in control of your sex hormone, so that last F stands for fornication, or sex. So that's the 5 Fs. The hypothalamus is in charge of feeding and drinking, fight or flight, Fahrenheit, and finally sex, right, or fornication. Those are the 5 Fs. So the hypothalamus governs the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. And again, if you are have finished watching this, or maybe you're doing it in the middle of watching this, number 8 on your sheet, the 2 little P-shaped structures, is the pituitary gland. And that sends a signal to the hormone systems, to the glands, to release sex hormones, to release blood sugar, thyroid, to control metabolism, right? All the things that we looked at on that slide a few minutes ago. So it governs the endocrine system via the pituitary gland, and this is linked to emotions and reward. There is a pleasure center or reward center that is basically connected to part of this limbic system. Technically, for Psych 1, we can say it's part of the hypothalamus. That is where dopamine goes, as I talked about the addiction pathway in the last lecture. So one of the things that you now have a basic understanding of, and hopefully agree with me, is that when we are looking at animal models like this rat, that we can see them doing basic behaviors that we ourselves as humans would do. If we like something, we go towards it. If we don't like something, we stay away from it. If we are scared of something, and this is a big one that I alluded to earlier, but I wanted to expand upon it, is if we are scared, sometimes we run away, sometimes we hide, sometimes we freeze like a deer in headlights. You're just frozen stiff. People that get stage fright in front of too many people on stage, they just freeze, right? That is a human response, and that is mostly an animal response. In fact, that's what we see in the animal kingdom with especially mice and rats, deer in headlights, right? And so if you think about this, think about people who are being sexually assaulted. I don't really want you to think about that in too much detail because it's gruesome, but all of these sexual assaults and rapes and things like that, a lot of these cases were thrown out back in the 80s and early 90s because the person didn't consent, but they didn't say no. A lot of times these victims, which are mostly women, would freeze. They would freeze up because they didn't know what to do. And that is the old brain animal instinct to freeze. It wasn't until about 1996 that a scientist in neuroscience named Dr. Porges, who I've had the pleasure of hanging out with and meeting, discovered this old way and said that is the response to fear. It's not saying yes or saying no, it's simply freezing, and that is linked to the emotion of being scared. So courts now cannot ignore this, and they can't throw out evidence because the person didn't say no. If you freeze, it's been noted through neuroscience that this is an appropriate response. So building on that, what we see here above on the top right is a rat that has an electrode that is placed in its brain near the reward or pleasure center. And here we see a stimulation pedal. Basically, what this rat has to do is if this rat pushes down on the pedal, it causes electrical activity in that part of the brain. Now, you guys are very familiar now that electrical activity can cause an action potential artificially and release dopamine into that pleasure center of the brain. We call it the nucleus accumbens. You don't need to know that. Rats also hate electrified grid floors. Now, again, the amount of shock that's given to these rats is equivalent to if you were to drag your feet on the carpet and then touch somebody and get a little static shock, or if you're in Vegas and with the really dry air and you touch something metal, it kind of stings a little bit for a second, half a second, and then you're just like, oh, that sucked, but it wasn't really necessarily painful. That's all that's given. But rats, of course, as you would probably expect, do not like the pain. So the question is, can we use these animal models with simple lower brain structures to actually look at complex human behavior and be able to compare them? And if your answer is still no, well, then let me allow you to open your mind. So I don't know if you've ever known anybody that has been addicted to drugs or alcohol, especially drugs. And when their brain is telling them they want that drug, they need that drug, then a lot of these people will do anything in their power to be able to get that drug into their system and satisfy their brain and their body. A lot of times it's opiates, which are painkillers. We'll go over that in chapter 3. So they would do unpleasant things, walk across broken glass, perform sexual acts that they're not happy about, steal from and hurt the people they love just to get that drug and make themselves feel better. So that is a very complex type of behavior. The question is, can we show this in an animal model using a simple rat? Well, the answer is yes, because that dopamine spike into the pleasure center or reward center of the brain, next to the hypothalamus or part of the hypothalamus, the question is, would this rat, and you can see that the rat would have to put all 4 paws on the electrified grid at least twice. It would have to take at least 8 steps to get to that pedal. And again, one shock is no fun for the rat. So the question is, will the rat brave it and walk over 8 steps over the electrified grid, shocking itself at least 8 times, just to get over to the pedal and push the button or the lever to stimulate that dopamine spike for a pleasurable sensation? And the answer is absolutely. Just like you would see a person addicted to drugs would walk over hot coals or shock floors or broken glass just to get that drug, a rat would risk the pain of going over a grid shock floor just to push that pedal and get that stimulation. So this rat has an electrode implanted in the reward center of the hypothalamus, and it will cross an electric grid accepting painful shocks in order to press the lever that sends rewards, basically impulses to its reward center, releases dopamine, and makes it feel really good. So yes, the answer is yes. We can take complex activity, complex human behavior, like what they would do when addicted to drugs, and we can show using animal models that animals will do the same type of behavior. Again, we don't have to ask them if they're addicted to anything. We're not making them addicted to anything, but you can still see the exact same type of behavior from a rat that really likes that pleasurable sensation. So again, short answer, yep, we can do it. Electronics, brain stimulation has been able to be advanced to even get them to almost use them as a remote control and be able to get them to go left, right, up, down, climb trees, under rubble, right? Things like that. So here you see on the left, Ratbot on a pleasure cruise. Researchers were able to use a remote control brain stimulator after they figured out how to get the muscles to interact from the motor centers of the brain and to guide rats across a field and even up a tree. Why would this be anything other than a fun toy? Because let's just say that there was damage from natural disasters and earthquakes and things like that, hurricanes. We can use Haiti as an example and the really bad earthquake they had a couple years ago. And maybe a lot of buildings crumbled and tumbled and we couldn't get humans under there. But you put a camera on old Ratbot here and you use the remote control to make it turn left, right, go up trees, go under the rubble. And maybe we can see if there were humans trapped underneath the rubble, that it would be worth it to come and rescue them and try to get them out. So using brain stimulation, we can control animals' actions in search and rescue operations and things like that. Of course, for human research, the reward center of the brain may be overactive or underactive. So people may be that have an overactive reward center may be more susceptible to drug addiction and the pleasurable effects of things. And then for reward deficiency syndrome, it's the opposite. People that don't have as much activity or have a lot of insensitivity to the pleasure center, and those are people who don't really find pleasure in a lot of things. Maybe we can reverse that and help them to feel pleasure when they generally did not in the past. So now we are at the point you should have had pretty much everything underneath the brain. Number one, of course, is the cortex itself. The only one that should be missing at this point from the front side of the paper is number 2. We will get to that at the very end of this chapter. That's called the corpus callosum, and we will get there. But for the cerebral cortex, now I'm going to urge you to look at the second page of the handout, which would normally be on the back if I gave it to you in class. And you can see that there are 4 lobes of the brain. Underneath, of course, there's the brainstem and the cerebellum. I did say that you did not have to label them. However, if you want to, of course, if it helps you study especially, please do. But there are 4 areas for you to fill in the 4 hemispheres. I'm sorry, not hemispheres, the 4 lobes of the brain. Each brain has 2 sides, as you can see. There is a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. That's where I was going with hemispheres. 2 hemispheres here. Here's again, the right side, the left side, and they share information with each other because, again, most of the stuff from the left side of the body is going to the right side of the brain or the right hemisphere. Most stuff from the right side of the body is going to the left hemisphere, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So each hemisphere has 4 lobes, and we can see them here. In the front, in blue, is the frontal lobe. Right behind that on the top in green is the parietal lobe. Below the frontal and parietal lobe in purple down here kind of sticks out like a thumb over the ear is the temporal lobe. And then finally in pink in the very back of the brain is the occipital lobe. And again, I told you at the beginning of this lecture with the fMRI that if we were to see this part of the brain in the back, the occipital lobe, light up, it means that somebody's looking at something and concentrating on it. So what I want for the homework assignment is for you to listen to the lecture, look at the book, go over the notes, and figure out what are the functions of each of these lobes. Fairly simple, and I will go through them with you. So you should have all the answers from my lecture directly. So the first part of the brain that we're going to talk about here is the biggest lobe of the brain called the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe towards the back has the motor cortex and is responsible for the main motor output of the brain. In the front of the frontal lobe, this big area here, that's called the prefrontal cortex, and that's actually involved in coordinating all the 5 senses, coordinating a lot of the other stuff from the brain and bringing it together. 5 senses coordination, emotions, memories, and things like that, so that we can make decisions, send information to the muscles about how to move away from danger towards something we like. Do we freeze when we're scared, right? It also allows us to plan out our day and coordinate our memories and things like that. So the frontal lobe has by far the most uses and is the most important of the 4 lobes. So here the motor cortex, which if I go back again, is located in the very back part of the brain here. And that is what goes through the pons down to the spinal cord and sends information to the muscles about what to do. There were two scientists named Fritsch and Hitzig that were the first ones that discovered where the motor cortex was. It was at the very back of the frontal lobes on the left and right side. And two other scientists named Forrester and Penfield a few years later were able to map out the motor cortex. Once we figured that everything in the cortex, was everything in the cortex was ran on electrical activity with the neurons, they were able to take this portion of the cortex and basically put an electrode in every single neuron and see where it corresponded to. So one of the coolest things about neuroscience is what we learned about the parts of the brain. A lot of that came from either trial and error by giving some electrical activity to it and causing action potentials, or people that had brain damage that could no longer do something. So if they came into a doctor's office and they could no longer speak, the doctor could see what part of the brain was damaged, and we knew that part of the brain was for speech or for vision or for, in this case, the motor cortex. You wouldn't be able to send the signal to the muscles. So Forrester and Penfield figured out which parts of the brain corresponded to which muscles by mapping it out and by using electrical activity to artificially send action potentials down the axons. And what they found was, in this whole area, the most biggest part of the cortex was dedicated to the areas of the brain or the areas of the body with the most nerves and the most specific small movements. So actually the face and the mouth, which needs to move in separate directions for the different types of words and syllables and pronunciations, depending on what language you have, that takes up the most amount of space. So the face and the mouth have the most amount of space, followed by sort of the fingers. And if you can think about it, your fingers have a lot of dexterity. They can move in a lot of different directions and do a lot of specific things, play instruments, right? Grab things, right? The ironic part is that in the motor cortex, the least amount of space is actually dedicated to the biggest surface area of the body. The trunk, which basically goes from, just below the shoulders to the thighs, just above the knees, although that's the biggest amount of space on the human body, it can't really go in a lot of different directions. You can move it front, back, side to side, kind of wiggle it around a little bit, twist it, but there's not a lot of specific intricate movement because it's such a big part of the body. Therefore, it doesn't need a lot of nerves or neurons to innervate that part of the body. So actually the trunk has a very small amount of area in the motor cortex to represent it. So again, electrically stimulating the motor cortex can cause the body part movement. And again, the reason why, you're basically creating an action potential, which is going to open the gates at the end and cause those neurotransmitters. And again, putting the big picture together, the one that goes to the muscles is acetylcholine. So if you artificially stimulate the motor cortex, it's going to send acetylcholine down through the spinal cord to the muscles, depending on where, what part of the motor cortex controls what area. So now you know. Again, here we see the motor cortex at the very back of the frontal lobe, and it's actually twins with the somatosensory cortex in yellow. That is the beginning of the parietal lobe. So one of the things that the parietal lobe does is interprets the sense of touch. And what we found, or what they found earlier, not me, is that the motor cortex and somatosensory cortex, which are right next to each other, actually have the same connections. So you can see that the biggest amount is the face and the mouth. Same thing here, face and the mouth. Next biggest is the fingers and the thumb. Fingers and the thumb. All the way down, again, the trunk, right, is the biggest part of the body, but the trunk is a very small portion of the cortex. And so if you're wondering to yourself, why are these twins? It's because we need a very quick response a lot of times if something is happening to the body. So this somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe is information coming up from the body. So let's say somebody's grabbing onto your forearm. That's going to go here, the arm, right? And it's going to hit here. And then what you want to do is get them to get off of you. So you move your arm to break their hold. Well, if you are, the information is here, sent here, right? Let's say it's right here. Then it goes right across to the motor cortex, and the information goes really quickly right back down to the body. So it's one swift, they grab you, you pull away in a matter of, half a second. And that way, if that's why they are basically twins. The motor cortex in blue is information that goes down to the muscles. The somatosensory cortex in yellow is information that comes up from the body. So we can react to something right away because we have an adjacent, like a twin part of the brain that is coordinating our movements. Looking at this, in case you ever wondered why people may become paralyzed, most of the time it's because if their spinal cord is injured, and you may have heard this, severed spinal cord, that means that information from the body about touch can't get up to the somatosensory cortex. And that also means at the same time, information from the motor cortex going back down to the body can't get there. So a person who has a spinal cord that's severed can't move, they become paralyzed because information can't go up, so they can't feel anything, they can't interpret it in the brain, and information from the motor cortex can't come down, so they can't move their muscles. But technology is working on ways to try to use electrical activity to bypass any sort of at least a wheelchair or control a TV, a remote control, or use the internet. So this is sort of the technology that's being worked on for the touch and motor systems to be able to get people who are paralyzed to at least get some function back by bypassing the injury to the spinal cord and using electrical activity to patch it up. So the somatosensory cortex, the parietal lobe back here, is involved in not just processing of the touch system, but is involved in attention. When we are able to pay attention to certain things or people or objects, that is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is also helping us to know where we are in space. So if I'm in a room, it helps me to understand how far away from the walls or a desk that I am. And sometimes knowing, even though I'm not looking behind me, I know that maybe there's a chair or a wall or something that's within arm's length behind me. So the somatosensory cortex is processing information from the skin senses, and this is where we talk about body parts movement, knowing where we are within our environment. In the occipital lobe, which is the one in the very back of the brain, this is what I was talking about with the fMRI, that it can light up and it shows the visual cortex of the occipital lobe, which is represented as blood flow, as a research participant looks at a photo. So I'm asking you to look at something. This part of the brain lights up. We can say, okay, they're looking at a picture or looking at something visually. When the person stops looking, the region calms down and we don't see this yellowish red on here. So this is why I said an fMRI could potentially be used to read your brain in a primitive sense. Speaking of which, the occipital lobe of the brain is the one in the very back here that was in pink earlier. and it is only responsible for one thing. It's got one job, and that one job is visual information. So everything from the eyes, and we will actually be able to trace from the eyes to the back of the brain in the next chapter, in chapter 6. So the occipital lobe has one job, and that is visual processing. Anything that has to do with processing color, shape, form, anything visual, right, is the occipital lobe, and that's its only job. So the visual cortex, again, is in the occipital lobe at the rear of the brain, and that receives input from your eyes, and your brain interprets what you're seeing in your outside world. In the temporal lobe, we have basically two and a half sort of functions. The auditory cortex is right above your ear in the temporal lobes, and that's the one that sort of sticks out like a thumb, and that receives information from your ears. So the main function of the temporal lobe is audition or hearing. Inside the temporal lobe on the inner part is actually where the hippocampus and amygdala are, and the hippocampus is also involved in aspects of memory formation. The hippocampus, as we'll learn in chapter 8, also is where short-term memory is sort of stored temporarily. So the temporal lobe is involved in memory, it's involved in audition, and also in speech, at least comprehension. Being able to understand what it is people are saying and get context. Sense of humor sometimes means getting the joke and reading between the lines. And that is partially due to the hippocampus. So that is the temporal lobe. So again, the parietal lobe is about the sense of touch. It's about attention. It's about knowing where you are in space. The occipital lobe is just vision and visual processing. The temporal lobe is about hearing or audition. It's memory function as well, and speech comprehension. And everything else, of course, is the frontal lobe, putting it all together, coordinating, and all of that. So those are the 4 lobes of the brain. Of course, these lobes work together, and in the cortex, there are also what we call association areas, which help to put more than one of the senses together. In the temporal lobe, there is a combining of visual and auditory processing so that we can read. So the temporal lobe is also involved with language. In the parietal lobe, there is combining vision and hearing with touch, so that we know maybe what's touching us or where something is coming from. And so we see, and then all 5 senses, of course, are put together because they all meet in the frontal lobe. So that enables us to judge things, to plan out things in advance, process new memories, emotional control, and decision making. In neuroscience, we also found these specific functions. We know what they were, as I alluded to, because damage to specific areas results in specific losses. And the first time that we ever figured this out was actually in about 1850, before psychology was even a thing, because this was still due to medical treatment. So one case that we're going to look at, and I've provided a link to the video for you, is a man named Phineas Gage. The curious case of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a man in his mid to late 20s who was helping to bring the railroad towards the West Coast. So literally, he was working on the railroad, right? And he was a blasting foreman for a railroad company that was coming west. Back in those days, in order to get the tracks going, because there were things like mountains and hills and all types of things in the way, they had to blast their way through so that the tracks would go straight and they could make a direct route with the train tracks. But one day, things went horribly wrong, and when he was blasting, one of the railroad rods or spikes blew up and went flying in the air and actually stuck through his eye and straight out his brain through the top of his skull. So you can see that researchers have reconstructed the probable path of the rod that went through Gage's brain. So what happened was, it didn't kill him, although it could have, and you can get more details from the video that I show you, is that what it did was it went through the frontal lobe of the brain, and it only seemed to have gone through one side, the left hemisphere, with the right hemisphere still being intact. Not only did Gage survive, but he became a different version of himself. And depending on who you ask, because everybody wanted a piece of the action, Gage was no longer himself. Some people said he was hyper aggressive and hypersexual, like a sexual predator. Some people said he kind of lumbered around like a zombie, which was what they observed in lobotomy patients. If you don't know what a lobotomy is, you can look it up. Some people said that he mistreated his wife and kids, except the fact that he didn't have a wife and kids. Like I said, everybody wanted a piece of the action. But what was determined is that Gage was no longer himself. Whether he was hyper aggressive, whether he was a total zombie, he was no longer the person that he was before the accident. So something in his brain must have, right, the damage in his brain must have caused him to act differently. This is really where the basis of phrenology came in, because Gage's personality traits became pretty different after that. And one of the remarkable things, although he didn't get a full recovery from this, a lot of his brain was able to, a lot of his function came back. He was relatively young, and again, because it only attacked one side of the brain, one hemisphere, the other one might have actually been engaged more so that he could live a somewhat normal life. Eventually, he went and drove stagecoaches in Chile, which may have actually served as sort of a rehab for him, spatial navigation and things like that. So what that showed us is that was really the first case that showed that damage to the brain may cause a very specific damage, and we may lose very specific functions. As we've already pointed out, the hippocampus, to the lobes, to the occipital lobe, right, all of these, that if there is damage in life, that the brain can somewhat mend itself, not fully, but it may be able to have one side take over for the rest. So if one hemisphere is damaged early in life, like with Phineas Gage, the other one could and will a lot of times assume many of the functions by either reorganizing or by building new pathways, alternate routes, kind of like if the freeway is under construction and you have to go around and take an alternate path. Sometimes the brain can do that and recruit more of the brain to be used as an alternate route. This ability to adapt and change, strengthen and weaken the neurons is called plasticity, because they're almost like plastic or movable. But of course, the older you get, the more plasticity diminishes. That's why older people that have strokes, a lot of times, if they lose their ability to speak or walk, it's a lot harder for them to be able to rehab, and they can't recover as well because the neurons aren't as plastic, and so they're not going to build alternate routes and things like that. As we get older, the reason we get weaker, the reason our hair turns gray, the reason our skin gets all saggy is because our DNA is slowly unraveling. It's in a nice double helix as we're older, as we're younger, but as we're older, it starts to unravel. And so we don't heal as fast, we can't recover from injury or sickness as easily, et cetera, et cetera. But when we're younger, the brain can sometimes mend itself by basically either changing routes, or sometimes it can form new neurons through this process called neurogenesis. Now, neurogenesis usually doesn't take place all over the brain. It usually only takes place in the hippocampus and in the smell system called the olfactory bulb. But it is, on rare occasions, it is true that the younger you are, if you suffer a brain injury, there may be new neurons to take over. But as you get older, again, this ability isn't there. So the last part of the brain, the last thing on your worksheet that we haven't talked about yet, is called the corpus callosum. And here you can see this white matter myelinated band of axons. And in this picture, you see only half the brain here. The other half has been removed. So this would be, this is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. Here's the cerebellum. Here's the brainstem. In this picture, we can see that this is the left hemisphere because the right one would be where it's missing. And so the corpus callosum is a large band of white matter axons that is connecting the left and right hemispheres and able to communicate. That's why if you're playing catch, like with a football or a basketball, you can use both hands at the same time to coordinate and put your hands around the ball. Even though it's different sides of the body and different sides of the brain. And it allows them to basically to communicate instantaneously. Here, this is a high resolution diffusion spectrum image showing a top view, and you can see here's the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, and all of these little axons here going across are make up the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is number 2 on your sheet, and the corpus callosum is responsible for coordinating information between the left and right hemispheres. It basically forms a neural bridge. People who have really bad epilepsy and seizures nowadays, again, we talked about seizures as too much electrical activity in the brain, and if you have seizures and they can't be controlled by medication, one of the things that neuroscientists can do to relieve it is to basically cut the fibers of the corpus callosum. They call this a corpus callostectomy. No, that's not going to be on the exam. But what it does is it basically causes what we call a split brain patient. So the left and right hemisphere are no longer able to easily communicate with one another, and that may actually cause a little bit of deficits from where information sharing used to take place. But one of the things that the corpus callostectomy did for neuroscience is it allowed us to understand if there were specific functions for the left and right side of the brain. And it turns out that when you cut the fibers of the corpus callosum, in the intact brain, data received are quickly transmitted across to the other side in milliseconds. So we can coordinate both sides of our brain and body together basically instantly. If you sever the corpus callosum, this information sharing does not take place. So this really helped researchers to understand the left side of the brain, what it does, versus the right side of the brain. Language is actually left hemisphere dominant. So the left hemisphere of the brain is controlling a lot of our aspects of language. Understanding language, speaking, right? Things like that. So each hemisphere performs distinct functions. Normally we have unified brains, which allow us to do these together, but information from split brain patients allowed us to understand what each hemisphere specifically is responsible for. We know that the left hemisphere is good at making quick, exact interpretations, so not just language itself, but the literal meaning. Children that don't understand sarcasm and get, read between the lines for jokes, if you are doing literal interpretations, actually listening to instructions, following along, and taking things literally, that's the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is actually better at making inferences, reading between the lines, understanding the nuances of a joke, modulating speech, understanding that if you end your sentence on a higher note, you're asking a question. If you end it on a low one, you're making a statement. And also facilitating self-awareness, knowing what you are doing, where you are at a certain time, understanding what's going on at the present time around you. That's also the right hemisphere. So the last thing we're going to talk about and cut off this chapter is handedness. As you probably know, handedness, left-handedness is a very recessive trait, and we're not going to get into genetics here, but nearly 90% of the population of people are right-handed, and that means that they process information, again, if they're right-hand dominant, their main processing is in the left hemisphere. So us left-handers are in our right mind. The universal prevalence of right-handers suggests a big genetic influence, as we know. You have to have two recessive genes, one from mom, one from dad, to be left-handed. And if nobody in your family is left-handed, and all of a sudden in either family is left-handed, and all of a sudden you find that you're left-handed, then it's probably because very religious parents thought that being left-handed was equivalent to being possessed by a demon or an evil spirit. So a lot of times, especially if you went to Catholic school or parents went to Catholic school, they were forced to go right-handed because being left-handed was seen as being evil. So that makes left-handedness a problem for some people. We know that because of disabilities like reading disabilities, dyslexia happens to be a right to left brain thing. Left-handers are more likely to have reading disabilities. They're more likely to have allergies. They're also more likely to have migraines. But we also see a bigger proportion of left-handers that are musicians, mathematicians, athletes, artists, doctors, right? Things like that. So nowadays, the pros and cons of left-handedness seem about equal. I know that I suck at art because when I was little, they didn't have left-handed desks or left-handed binders or things like that. And so cutting, they didn't have left-handed scissors, right? So I had to try to use everything right-handed. It didn't always go well. There's also a rumor that people who are left-handed have about a 10 to 12 year less lifespan on average than right-handers, and that actually was because of the Industrial Revolution around 1900 when things like cotton gins and printing presses and things like that were made into machines. Those machines were made for right-handed people because, again, 90% of the population was right-handed. So a lot of people that tried to be part of the Industrial Revolution, if you're left-handed trying to operate a machine across your body with your left hand, there were a lot more accidents and a lot of people that died younger. So now we say that the pros and cons are about the same because left-handers no longer have a shortened lifespan because you have to take it with a grain of salt. The other interesting thing about this is that if you've ever heard the term sinister, which means evil, sinister actually comes from the Greek word sinestre, which means left-handed. So again, there was a huge belief with the religious rebellion and all of that, that people who were left-handed were possessed by demons or evil spirits, and so they were forced to go right-handed. I personally love being left-handed, other than the lack of art skills. And so I carry that as a symbol of pride. And any of you other left-handers out there, you should do that too. So that's it for chapter 2. I'm sorry if this was a lengthy lecture, but we got through it in 2 sittings, and now you have enough information, the prologue, chapters 1 and 2 for the first exam. So good luck, and I'll see you in chapter 6. All right. Everybody have a good rest of your day or evening, and I'll talk to you soon.